Good morning, 5B. Right, okay, we are moving on with chapter 33 of The Other Side of Truth. This chapter is called Waiting. The taxi engine chugged noisily while the children clambered out. The front door swung open. Even from the gate, Sada could see the worry in Aunt Gracie's face. The grey in her hair seemed to have streaked her cheeks. Uncle Roy had his arm around her. He looked solemn rather than cross. Aunt Gracie quietly insisted the children eat before Sade was asked to explain exactly where they'd been and what they'd done. Femi was silent again. When Sade spoke, she fixed her gaze on Aunt Gracie's collar. It was her fault. Aunt Gracie had been so upset and Uncle Roy had been out searching the streets for them. But as she related how Mr. 7 o'clock had given both of them hot chocolate and how he listened so carefully, both adults seemed to ease a little. "So he really listened to your story," Aunt Gracie said. "He looks a decent enough man. Now we must wait and see, huh?" Uncle Roy was cautious. The following evening at 7 o'clock, the children joined Aunt Gracie and Uncle Roy in front of the television. The main stories came first, then the rest of the news. Sade had made a special telephone call to Papa to make sure that he too was watching, but she avoided telling him exactly how she and Femi had got to see Mr. 7 o'clock. Papa sounded pleased. All the detainees shared a single television. Most of them eagerly followed the news just like Papa, always hoping to hear something from their own countries. A few preferred the game shows, films or sport, and arguments occasionally flared up. But Papa had been confident he could persuade the others tonight. Sade tried to imagine them. Papa trying to remain calm, perhaps with his friends from Somalia and Bosnia next to him. Would they really believe that Papa's children could get his story on the television? That night, Mr. 7 o'clock and the other presenters said nothing at all about Papa, nor the evening after. "Don't give up yet," Uncle Roy advised. "They have to check everything. It must take time getting the information from Nigeria." But Sade's hopes were dipping. On the telephone, Papa was sounding quieter. No letter had come back from the Union of Journalists, and there was no further news from Mr. Nathan. She could not concentrate in any of her classes. Even in English, where Mr. Morris asked them to research and write a short piece for a news program such as Making News. They had to work in pairs, and Mr. Morris put her with Mariam. Their silences were awkward, especially when Donna poked her head up between them. "What's up then? I thought you were mates and all." Sade would have liked to have slapped the grin from her face, but instead Donna's words burned into her. Mariam looked miserable as well. Both Sade and Mariam told each other they had no ideas for a news program. On Friday evening after supper, Sade said she was going to her bedroom to do her homework. Instead, she crept under her quilt, staying there until just before 7 when she forced herself downstairs. Auntie and Uncle were watching the television, but Femi had turned his back. He was slapping cards onto the carpet in a game of patience, making clicking and sucking sounds with his tongue and teeth. Sade sank into the sofa. Mr. 7 o'clock was behind his desk, waiting for the fanfare of music to stop. If nothing else, she liked his tie. It was pleasantly bright, purple orange shading into a sunset of red, pink and purple. Papa disliked wearing ties, but even he might like this one. They hadn't spoken for a couple of days. Was he still bothering to get people to watch the news? Suddenly, Sade sat bolt upright. Papa was smiling from a large square behind Mr. 7 o'clock, a much younger Papa, but definitely their father. "Femi, look!" Femi swiveled around. "A Nigerian journalist, Mr. Folarin Salaja, currently being detained after attempting to enter Britain illegally, is at the centre of a growing dispute. A spokesman for the Nigerian government has said that Mr. Salaja is wanted for murder and should be returned to Nigeria. Mr. Salaja, however, is claiming political asylum. Coming so soon after the execution of the Nigerian writer Mr. Ken Saro-Wiwa, the case is politically sensitive. Mr. Nelson Mandela, President of South Africa, has continued to urge a tougher line against Nigeria's military dictators. But here in Britain, the government has been taking a line against asylum seekers, claiming many are not genuine refugees. To discuss the situation, we have in the studio Tara Mosam, a writer and filmmaker who's recently returned from Nigeria, where she followed the case of Ken Saro-Wiwa. Tara Mosam, first of all, what do you know about Folarin Salaja? The camera swung to an earnest young woman with a bob of black hair fanning out from her cheeks. Folarin Salaja is well known within Nigeria as one of a small band of very courageous journalists who still dare to tell the truth about abuses of human rights by the military government. He writes for the small but important weekly paper Speak, which has been playing a dangerous cat-and-mouse game with the authorities. The newspaper staff have moved their offices several times to avoid being closed down by the police. But unlike Ken Saro-Wiwa, Mr. Salaja is not well known outside of Nigeria. What events actually led him to seek asylum here? Mr. 7 o'clock leans slightly forward like he'd done across the table a few nights earlier. About 5 weeks ago, there was an attempt on his life. Unknown gunmen called at his house, fatally shooting his wife instead of him. Apparently, he'd been receiving death threats for some time but had ignored them. However, after the assassination of his wife, he went into hiding. The Home Office say he was arrested a couple of weeks ago, trying to enter through London Airport on a false passport. They say he did not declare on asylum, but he was a political refugee, and he didn't ask for a political asylum until his identity was challenged, so they intend to deport him. Is there anything stopping them? Mr. Salaja has appealed on the grounds his life will be in danger if he's returned to Nigeria, and that his children are also here in England. He says they were smuggled here immediately after their mother's death, but the Home Office claims to have no record of them. Mr. 7 o'clock looked grave. Was he going to say he'd actually met them? Tell everyone the Home Office was wrong? Sade felt blood flush to her face. I gather there is a warrant out for Mr. Salaja's arrest in Nigeria. Mr. 7 o'clock was straightening up. Yes, a further twist. Mr. Salaja has now been accused of murdering his wife, and Nigeria wants him extradited. Already some Nigerians are saying the murder charge is an attempt to throw a cloak over the real assassins. But of course it would be extremely dangerous for Folarin Salaja if he were to be deported. As you know, there was a great deal of criticism about the trial of Ken Saro-Wiwa and his colleagues. Well, I imagine we shall be hearing more of this case. Thank you very much, Tara Mosam. After the break, we shall... And Uncle Roy began to clap. Congratulations, children. My goodness, you actually did it. But he didn't say it was us. We told him. Femi looked confused. Our teacher said, you have to stick to the main points, explained Sade. That was probably it, Aunt Gracie said gently. But now your daddy is in the news. It won't be so easy for them to send him straight back. In the morning, Uncle Roy took Sade and Femi to the library to search through the day's newspapers. 3 of them had printed stories about Papa, one with the same photograph of Papa as a young man. They read the newspapers out on the dining room table to read them again. Suddenly, Sade spotted a couple of sentences near the end of one report they had all missed before. A spokesman for Nigerians for Democracy announced that his organisation would mount a demonstration on Sunday for the release of Mr. Salaja. Unconfirmed reports suggest that Mr. Salaja has begun a hunger strike in protest at his detention. This book, just when you think it's going good, something else happens. All right, more next time.